He bought her freedom at the trading post, but she was already marked for death by her tribe. The sun hung like a punishment over the flat land, and everything beneath it baked in silence. Dust drifted slow as ash across the hardpan road, and even the flies moved with reluctance. There were no songs at the trading post, not that day, not in that heat. The wind had gone somewhere else. What remained was the sound of old wood creaking and iron scraping against worn leather, and the faint whisper of chains dragging behind a pair of tired legs. She was small, but held like something dangerous, wrists bound, ankles tethered. A single braid clung to her back like a shadow, tight and dark. Her face gave nothing, not rage, not fear, just the long, practiced quiet of someone who knew that. Nothing she said would change anything. The trader leading her forward barked half-laughs to no one in particular, boasting about the price she'd fetch. Said she was strong, said she didn't cry, said she was the kind that lasted. He spat and adjusted the buckle on his belt as if that proved something. The men gathered around the post watched her like they'd watch any animal too wild to tame. Some leaned forward, some looked away. One boy dropped his hat. A horse shifted in the shade. Just one. Broad chestnut, not tied. Still as a statue, save for the flick of a tail. Beside it stood a man, tall with weather in his skin and silence in his spine. His hands were rope-scarred and still. He leaned against the post like he'd been there a long time, like the heat didn't bother him anymore. Nobody noticed him at first. Not really. The trader kept talking, about her tribe, about the raid, about the bounty her own people had posted for her return, dead or near enough. Said she'd broken law, blood, or something worse, some word that meant traitor in a tongue only a few still spoke. She stood in that dust and didn't flinch. The chains shifted once around her ankles and stopped. Her eyes stayed low, not in shame, but in the way of someone measuring the ground for the quickest path out, even with no chance of taking it. The trader's voice kept rising. Said she was a good deal. Half price, today only. One of the ranchers laughed like... It was funny. Then the man by the horse moved. He didn't speak. Just walked forward, boots whispering in the dirt, and pulled something from his coat. The shine of silver. A pouch of coin. Nothing heavy, but enough to make the trader pause. The man set it on the barrel beside the girl, like he was buying oats or nails. The trader frowned. You ain't serious. The man's face didn't move. He nodded once, slow. The kind of nod that ends arguments before they begin. The trader shifted, licked his lips, glanced at the girl, then back at the pouch. She don't even talk, he muttered. Might be cursed. Marked by her people. They find her, they'll take her head and yours just for looking at her. Still, the hand didn't move from the pouch. The trader looked around, searching for someone to scoff with him. Found no one brave enough. The sun kept pressing down. He spat again. Fine. Your coin. The keys came out, jangling like rattlesnake. Teeth. They dropped into the man's palm. Heavy. Cold. He knelt, slow as if in prayer, and undid the lock at her ankles first, then her wrists. The man did not touch her skin. He let the irons fall into the dirt. She did not run. She didn't thank him either. Her arms hung like branches too long in winter. She met his eyes for just a second, like a bird gauging wind, and then looked past him toward the edge of the open plain. He turned and walked back to the horse. Stopped. Waited. She stood there in the heat, her dress dust-heavy, her lips cracked, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly, not from fear, but from the shock of still being alive. No one said anything. No one moved. The trader leaned against the doorframe like maybe he'd changed his mind and wanted the money back, but not badly enough to ask. She followed him. Not quickly, not desperate, just forward, the way a storm does when it knows where it's going. The man mounted and held out his hand. She looked at it for a beat too long, then reached for the saddle instead and pulled herself up behind him. No help, no words, just breath and motion. They rode out as the shadows began to shorten, heading east where the road curved into hills. Behind them, the chains sat in the dirt like shed skin. No one followed. For a long time they rode in silence, dust behind them, dust ahead. The heat still unbroken, but the wind beginning to shift. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. There was only the rhythm of the horse and the creak of leather, and two hearts trying to remember what it meant to beat outside a cage. When the sun tilted low, he slowed the horse near a stream and dismounted. She waited until he tied the reins, then stepped down and walked to the water's edge without looking back. She knelt, cupped water in her hands, and drank. He watched her from a distance, arms crossed, leaning on a fence rail no longer standing. She stayed there a long time, letting the water drip from her chin, watching the light catch on the river stones. By the time the sky began to shade purple, he had built a small fire beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. She didn't come right away, but when the wind picked up and night pressed close, she moved toward the warmth, sat down near the edge of it, not near him, not far. He passed her a tin cup of beans and another of water. She took them without looking up, ate slow. He didn't ask what she'd done to be marked. She didn't ask why he'd paid so much for silence. The fire cracked between them. The night didn't speak. She curled up in the blanket he left beside her. Not the one he used for his own warmth. A better one. Softer. Still smelling of cedar. He sat a while longer, whittling something from pine. Small. Delicate. A habit, not a purpose. Just motion for hands that had seen too much stillness. Before he lay down, he glanced once at her, just a shape curled beside the fire, and then looked back up at the stars. They were bright tonight, too bright to ignore, like they had something to say but no voice for saying it. In the dark, she opened her eyes, listened to the sound of his breath steady beside hers. And though the fear still clung to her ribs, and the brand of her people still burned unseen on her back, something in the quiet shifted. Not safety, not yet, but something softer. Possibility, maybe. Not for joy, not even for peace, just for the chance to be something more than hunted. The fire hissed once, and the wind carried the ashes downriver. She did not sleep easily, but she slept, and when morning came, she was still there. The hills that cradled his land were not steep, just patient, worn by wind and years into long, thoughtful shapes. Pines grew where the ground allowed it, slow and knotted, the kind that had lived through more than one fire and still reached for the sky anyway. The house sat in the middle of it all, quiet as a breath held too long. One room, a porch, a shed, and a broken fence line that traced the edge of what had once been ambition. He didn't say much when they arrived, only pointed to the creek that ran near enough for washing and showed her where the food was kept. The barn, the outhouse. He left her a room, small and plain, with a bed that didn't sag and a window that opened toward the mountains. There were no locks on the door, none on his either. She slept with her back to the wall, one hand curled under the blanket where she could reach the knife she didn't yet trust him enough to ask for. He must have known. On the second night, she found one wrapped in oilcloth, set beside the basin. She didn't touch it at first, just stared at it like it might be a trap. By dawn, it was hidden under her pillow. He didn't comment, just poured coffee and passed her a tin of biscuits when she came out to the porch. She sat on the step far enough to run, close enough to feel the fire he built every morning, even in summer. There were rhythms to the way he moved, chopping wood, checking the horse's shoes, mending the fence one post at a time. He didn't rush, didn't complain, just worked like someone who understood the world would fall apart without effort, and maybe even with it. She watched, at first because she didn't trust him, then because the stillness he carried felt like something she hadn't known could exist. He moved like he didn't need anyone to see him, like peace wasn't a performance. She swept the porch one morning while he was out checking the traps and left the straw broom leaning against the door upright and tidy. The next day, he sharpened her knife and laid it back in the oilcloth. They never spoke of these things, but they piled up quietly between them like small stones along a path. The dog showed up a week in, ribs sharp, eyes cautious. He didn't chase it off, just left scraps on the edge of the porch and let it choose. Eventually, it curled up near the steps and stayed. It didn't have a name, but she talked to it in the mornings sometimes, words that came from old places in her mouth. She began to rise before dawn, out of habit, braided her hair tight, washed her face in the creek, pressed her palms into the dirt to feel what the day was made of. One morning, she found the snare line empty but freshly set. He'd shown her without showing left markers she could follow. There was no mention of the post, no return to that road. The world narrowed to the cabin, the woods, the pale blue sky that held its breath above them. But even peace, when built too fast, trembles like a table with one short leg. Sometimes, at night, she'd wake to the sound of her own breath caught in her throat, and she'd stare at the ceiling, wide-eyed, listening for the cries that weren't there, the raid, the fire, the girl screaming her name as she ran. Her sister's hand had slipped from hers too easily. The guilt didn't speak out loud, but it settled like dust in the lungs. He heard her once, retching behind the shed in the dark. Didn't ask questions, just set a small clay cup of mint tea on the windowsill before sunrise. The smell reminded her of her grandmother's tent, the way old stories curled around the steam. That morning, when he passed her on his way to the barn, she looked up. Not a smile, not quite. But her eyes didn't flinch. She found the pouch under the porch in late August, stuffed in an old rabbit hole, wrapped in deer hide. Inside, a bundle of dried sage, 2 feathers tied with a blue thread, a carved bone with her tribe's mark etched faintly into the side. Her medicine bag, lost in the fight. She'd thought it burned. She turned it over in her hands, thumb tracing the edge. He must have ridden back, found it among the ashes or blood or scattered debris. He hadn't said a word. That night, she sat closer to the fire. Her knife, still on her belt, but her feet tucked under her instead of angled for flight. He carved a shape from pine, small and slow. A bird this time. She watched him work, the blade catching light, the curl of shavings like wind-blown petals. "You went back," she said not loud. He didn't look up, just nodded. "Why?" He rubbed the back of his neck, shrugged. "Figured it was yours." That was all. No questions, no story, just the truth folded small between them. She didn't thank him. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because words like that couldn't hold what she meant. Instead, she took one of the blankets from the shelf, washed it in the creek, and left it beside his bedroll while he was outside with the horse. He found it and didn't move it for 3 days. Then he used it, folded over twice at the edge, like it had always belonged there. She asked to help mend the fence. He handed her nails and didn't treat her like she was made of glass. That mattered. One afternoon, while clearing weeds near the back slope, she heard a hawk cry and looked up just in time to see him watching her from the ridge, his face unreadable. Not guarded, just waiting. She stood straight, hands on her hips, hair wild and cheeks flushed, and met his gaze without looking away. For the first time, something like understanding passed between them. Not soft, not sudden, just steady. She didn't need saving. He knew that. What she needed was space enough to stand in without someone trying to pull her back into the fire. Late that evening, she found a small cedar figure set on the windowsill. A woman, in a cloak, her hand raised like she was holding off the storm. The carving wasn't perfect, but the care was in every line. She didn't ask if it was for her, just took it inside and placed it beside the medicine pouch. As the nights grew cooler, they worked a rhythm into the walls of the place, unspoken but known. He mended, she gathered, he cooked, she cleaned. Sometimes she told the dog old stories in her tongue. Sometimes he played a worn harmonica with more breath than tune. It didn't matter. The sound filled the quiet in a way that let her sleep deeper. Once she left her door open all night by mistake, woke with the wind curling her blanket. When she looked out, the porch light still glowed. The wind carried voices now and then, nothing clear, but the kind of unease that came before a storm. She kept her blade sharp. He cleaned his rifle. Neither spoke of it. There was peace here. But peace, she'd learned, could be the soft moment just before the branch broke. Still, when she lay down that night, she did so without clutching her knife, and that meant something. The snow hadn't come yet, but the cold had started whispering through the trees in the early hours. Frost rimmed the water buckets each morning. The fire took longer to catch. Even the dog slept closer to the porch steps now, fur lifted against the wind. She felt it before she saw it. That shift in the air, the kind that doesn't have a shape but always leaves a mark. A silence that wasn't peace. A presence she couldn't name yet. She stepped out before sunrise to fetch water, and found the footprints pressed into the mud behind the shed. Not his, not hers. Too light to be a man's, too deliberate to be an animal's. 4 toes, wide set, meant for stalking. She crouched and touched the edge with her fingers, cold, recent, and moving east to west, toward the pines. She said nothing. At breakfast, just sat a little straighter, eyes more alert. He noticed the way her hand hovered by the knife on her belt, the way she didn't lean back in the chair like usual. He didn't ask. That day, she didn't help with the fence. Instead, she walked the tree line, marked spots with small stacks of stones, bits of cloth tied to branches, quiet signals only someone from her world would understand. They would read them as warnings or invitations. She wasn't sure which one she meant. By the time the sun began to drop, she'd circled the entire northern edge of the property. When she returned, the dog met her with ears pinned, tail low, not scared, watchful. She gave it a slice of dried meat and sat on the porch with the rifle he'd left near the door. He didn't ask what she saw. She didn't say what followed her back. That night the wind turned and carried wood smoke from the west, not theirs. Distant, faint, but real. Someone else had lit a fire in a place where no one else should have been. He laid extra wood beside the door and locked the barn. She moved her sleeping roll into the main room near the fire instead of the bed tucked, away in the corner. Still no words, but both of them knew. Something was coming. By the 3rd morning, she stopped sleeping through the night. She'd rise in the dark and walk the porch barefoot, hair unbound, scanning the hills. Once, she heard a branch snap, a clean break, and didn't breathe until the sound faded into nothing. She'd seen this before. The waiting, the slow, circling. Her people didn't always take what they wanted with noise. Some punishments came soft, without warning, until it was too late to run. She still remembered the last face she saw in her village. Her cousin, eyes like polished river stones, jaw set with judgment. He'd been the one to find her first, when she slipped away before the wedding. He hadn't shouted, hadn't struck her, just looked at her like she was a wound no one could close. And then he let her go, not out of mercy, out of certainty. They would come for her eventually, not because they missed her, but because some choices weren't allowed to live. That evening, she cooked. Beans and cornbread spiced with wild onion, and bits of venison from the trap line. He didn't say anything, but she caught him watching her hands as she stirred, the way they moved with ease now, no hesitation. She wasn't just surviving, she was rooted. That mattered. After they ate, She stepped outside with the rifle again. The moon was half full, shadows long and blue over the grass. She stood without moving for so long the dog fell asleep beside her feet. He joined her with a second rifle, held it casually, not like a threat, like part of his arm. They stood, side by side, not looking at each other. "You seen them?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "How many? 2? Maybe 3. Could be more. They're good at hiding." He shifted his weight. "What do they want?" She didn't answer right away. The wind tugged her braid over one shoulder. She stared into the trees like they might speak. "To finish what I ran from." He didn't push for more. Later that night, as she lay awake listening to the fire pop and settle, she thought of the songs her mother used to hum while grinding corn, low, slow, and full of ache. Songs about women who ran, about women who stayed. None had easy endings. In the morning, she found a new carving beside her plate. Not a bird this time, a fox, curled as if asleep, small enough to fit in her palm. She tucked it into the folds of her sash without a word. They checked the trap lines together. Walked without speaking. She carried the rifle. He carried the pack. At one point he stopped, crouched, and pointed at the earth. Tracks. Faint. Human. Recent. Her chest tightened. She knelt beside him and traced them. "He's close." "He?" She didn't look up. "My cousin. He'll come first. The others will wait. You think he'll talk?" She looked at the hills. "I think he wants to see if I've forgotten how to fear him." They walked back in silence. The air felt brittle. Leaves crunched beneath their feet like paper. She prepared that evening like the storm was already at the door. Cleaned her blade. Braided her hair twice. Rolled tobacco and pine resin into a twist and set it to dry beside the hearth. He dug a second fire pit behind the cabin, where the smoke would rise lower and be lost in the trees. A trick from an older war. When she came to help, he handed her flint and stepped back. The work of preparing wasn't loud. It didn't cry out. It moved like prayer. Slow, sure, necessary. After supper, she sat by the old fence post they hadn't repaired yet. The wood still leaned, but it held. Like her. He came over and leaned, beside it. "Why'd you run?" She looked at the dirt, then at the horizon. "Because I was told to marry a man who hurt girls smaller than me. Because when I told the elders, they said the peace he brought was more important than what he'd done." His jaw flexed. "They said I was being selfish, that I was born to carry the tribe's future. I said I'd rather carry my own." He nodded once, not like he understood it all, but like he knew what it meant to choose silence over shame. She glanced at him. "You think they'll come tonight?" He looked to the trees. "Might." She let her. Fingers traced the fox in her sash. "If they do, I want them to see I'm not alone." "They already see that," he said. Later, when the fire was low and the dog began to growl low in its throat, she rose and picked up her blade. He took the rifle. They stood on the porch again, watching, waiting. She didn't shake. And somewhere in the trees, a branch bent where no wind moved. The mark was painted in blood. They found it at dawn, smeared on the barn door in rough, deliberate strokes. Not a warning, not a taunt, but a judgment. The shape was unmistakable. A jagged crescent with a cut through its center. It was old as fire, meant exile, meant death if found outside the tribe. No trial, no mercy. She stood before it without speaking. The dog stayed close, hackles half raised, sensing what the scent said more than the symbol. He came from the cabin with his rifle, saw the blood, and didn't ask questions. Just looked at her, waiting. She stepped forward, fingers brushing. The edge of the dried mark. Her face did not change, but her shoulders tensed the way stone does before it splits under frost. "It's official now," she said. "I'm prey." He looked at the trees, then at her. "You were always prey?" She shook her head. "I was once promised. Then I ran. That made me a wound that wouldn't close." She didn't say what it felt like to be hunted by your own kin, what it did to a soul to know that home now meant the same thing as danger. But he read it in the way she held herself. No flinch, no tears, just the calm of someone who'd known. This was coming and dared to live anyway. She spent that day gathering, not just food or water, pieces of herself, tying back the parts she'd loosened in comfort. She moved through the house as if memorizing it just in case. As if this place might be taken from her as quickly as it had been given. He didn't stop her. He repaired the window hinges and moved the axes to the back door. At midday, he took down the photograph that had hung above the mantel since his wife's death. Not to forget her, but to make space. That evening, she spoke of her sister for the first time. They sat near the fire, the air brittle, the light soft on the walls. Her name was Sani, 2 years younger, bright, laughed too much. She braided her hair in patterns that annoyed our mother. Her voice cracked, but only for a breath. She was there the night I left. I told her why I couldn't stay. She didn't try to stop me. She handed me dried meat and hugged me so tight it hurt. She looked down. "I don't know what," they told her after. "If she was punished too. If she even believes I'm alive." He said nothing, just poured her another cup of coffee, set it gently near her hand. "I don't regret leaving," she said, "but I regret not fighting harder before I did." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Sometimes leaving is the only fight you get to win." She looked at him, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. Not gratitude, something older, sadder, recognition. As if she knew now that his silences came from places just as broken as hers. Later, she brought out her medicine pouch, sat by the fire and opened it. One by one, she laid the contents, in a circle. Feathers, stones, the carved bone, a bit of ochre. The fox carving he'd made her sat among them. She added a small scrap of fabric she'd taken from the barn, soaked in the blood from the mark. He watched her press it between 2 stones, whispering something low and steady. A prayer, maybe. Or a promise. She caught him watching and spoke without looking up. "It's not a curse I'm breaking. It's a memory. They want me to disappear. I won't." The next morning, the air smelled of wood smoke again. Thicker now, closer. The tracks near the creek were fresh. 3 sets, one heavier than the others, one with a limp, one moving wide, flank position. She knew the patterns. "They're trying to box me in." He checked his rifle, set traps in a crescent around the rear of the property. She sharpened her blade and laced her boots tight. No words passed, none needed. When night came, it brought silence so heavy it felt like weight on the chest. No owls, no wind, just the creak of old boards and the low flicker of firelight across their faces. She stood at the window. He sat near the door. "When they come," she said, "let me speak first." He nodded. "And if they don't listen, then they'll never hear anything again." Her voice didn't shake. The dog paced, restless, nose twitching toward the north. Sometime past midnight, a figure stepped from the trees, alone. Tall, wrapped in shadows and deerskin, face painted, in lines that meant blood owed and blood taken. She stepped outside before the figure reached the porch. He stopped 5 paces away. "Cousin," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, older, but still carried the same cold precision. "You should have died with your honor." She didn't blink. "I chose not to marry a man who beat children and raped the weak." His eyes narrowed. "That union would have ended the war between our clans. Your comfort was not the price of peace. So you sold mine instead?" He lifted his chin. You dishonored us. I am here to bring balance. She stepped closer. I have already balanced it. I am alive. He looked past her, at the cabin, the firelight within, the man in the shadows. You live with him now? A white man who buys women in chains? He didn't buy. Me. He released me. Same price. She almost smiled. You don't understand freedom. You never did. He pulled a blade from his belt. She drew hers too, but she didn't lift it. Instead, she dropped it into the dirt between them, stepped back. You came to kill a traitor. I'm not one. I'm just no longer yours. Behind him, the trees moved. More shapes stepped forward, faces painted, eyes hard. She did not flinch. She stood alone. Until he stepped out, the rancher rifle in his hands, steady, aimed not at her cousin, but at the man beside him. No one spoke. She raised her voice again. If you still follow your own law, then know this. I have spilled no blood. I have not taken from you. I have made no threat. You marked me for death. That blood now lies on your hands. Her cousin looked at her, looked at the rifle, looked at the man behind her, and then, after a long pause, turned his palm to the sky and dropped his blade. He walked away. The others followed, one by one. No words, just fading shadows among the pines. She stood there a long time after they vanished, then turned back to the porch to the man who had not spoken, only stood. She met his eyes. I didn't need saving, she said. He nodded. But I was never going to let you stand alone. She bent, picked up her knife, wiped the blade clean. Inside, the fire still burned, and outside, the stars had begun to appear, steady, scattered and ancient, not watching, just shining. The fire burned low before dawn, throwing long shadows on the cabin walls as if the room itself was remembering. She sat near it, cross-legged, her hands moving steadily through her hair as she wove the final braid tight, low at the nape. The dog lay curled at her side, one eye open, ears twitching with each sound beyond the walls. Outside, the wind had gone still. The forest was holding its breath. He hadn't slept. She could tell by the way he moved. Not tired, but careful. Like a man who'd already accepted what the day might ask of him. His rifle leaned against the table, oiled, loaded. On the counter, a satchel with medicine, dried food. A second, knife. Preparations not for escape, but survival. She rose without a word, pulled on her boots, checked her belt. The blade slid clean into its sheath. She glanced at him once. A brief touch of eyes, then stepped out onto the porch. The sky was silver, not quite morning. Mist clung to the ground, softening the shape of things. But there was no mist in her. She was all edge and memory now. He joined her in silence. Together they watched the tree line. She didn't ask if he would stand with her. He didn't ask if she wanted him to. Some things didn't need naming. The first figure appeared just as the sun cut its first line. Across the horizon, a blur between pine trunks, then another, then four more. Moving slow, steady. A formation meant not for surprise, but for certainty. We came, and we are not afraid. She stepped forward first, her feet crunching softly on the frosted grass. Her cousin walked at the front, the mark of their clan still, painted across his face, red against brown. His eyes did not soften. He looked at her like she was a question that had never been answered. You knew this wasn't over, he said, voice quiet but cutting. I did, she replied. You could have come back. You could have listened. He looked at the man behind her, the rancher with a gun in his hand and nothing else. His eyes narrowed. Still you hide behind a white man. Still you blame one woman for your shame. His jaw flexed. The others behind him began to fan out. A half circle. Measured. Intent. You broke law, cousin. You left your people in a time of need. I left a man who made girls into silence. I left elders who told me that peace meant pain. I chose to live. He stepped closer. And now I choose to stand. There was no more warning. Her cousin moved first, a sharp draw of his blade and a lunge that kicked dirt behind his heels. She met him halfway. The steel rang out clear as a bell in the hush. Her knife blocked his, deflected up, and her elbow drove into his ribs. He grunted, but didn't stumble. Another man charged, tall, heavy, swinging wide. The rancher stepped. Forward then, fast and sure, the butt of his rifle striking the attacker square in the temple. The man dropped. They didn't try to kill. Not first, not yet. But the fight wasn't kind. It was tight, brutal, silent, except for breath and the quick, ugly sound of impact. She ducked a swing, rolled across the ground, and came up with her, blade at a man's throat. He backed off. Her cousin wasn't so easily swayed. "You fight well for someone who ran," he spat, circling her. "And you speak too much for someone who's supposed to be a warrior," she said, and threw a fist into his mouth. He stumbled, spitting blood. Then something changed. A cry from the woods. Not human. A hawk or something like it, but louder. The remaining warriors stopped, looked to him, waited. He raised a hand. They paused. She stood in the center of them, blood on her cheek, panting, blade in hand. She did not tremble. "If you take me now," she said, "you make me a martyr, not a lesson. You tell your daughters that silence is better than freedom." Her cousin wiped his mouth. "You are nothing but a broken link, a shame we've carried too long." "Then cut the chain," she said. "Let me go. Let your son see what it means to walk away and not become cruel." Behind her, the rancher said nothing. Rifle still raised. A wall. She turned to her cousin. "This land doesn't need more blood. Let me bury what I was. Let me become what you never had the courage to be." He stared at her. For a long time, he said nothing, then lowered his blade. "You think survival is victory," he said, "but some wounds follow you wherever you sleep." She stepped forward, quiet, slow, and handed him a feather from her pouch, long, black, tipped with ochre, a symbol of farewell. He looked at it. "Keep it," he said. And then he turned. The others followed. Not one word spoken. Only the sound of retreat, of something loosening, breaking, shifting. She didn't move until their shapes vanished back into the trees, didn't sheathe her blade, just stood there, chest rising and falling as the wind finally returned through the branches. The rancher came to her side. Blood dotted his knuckles, a scrape across his shoulder. She turned to him, exhausted, mouth slightly open like she'd forgotten how to breathe. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. They stood like that for a while, until the mist lifted and the sun warmed the earth. Later, they sat by the river. She washed her hands in the cold water, watched the red trail float downstream, thin and fading. He set his rifle beside him, pulled off his gloves, said nothing. The dog came and lay between them, belly up to the breeze, tongue lolling, as if the world had never been broken. She took the fox carving from her pocket, held it in her palm, smoothed a thumb over its back. "You knew this wouldn't be easy," she said. "I knew it was right," he replied. They didn't look at each other when they spoke. She reached into her pouch and drew out the bone talisman, the one marked with her clan's sign. She held it over the water, hesitated, then let it go. It sank slowly, gone before the ripple reached the bank. "Not all things can be buried," she said. "No," he agreed, "but some things can be left behind." That evening, they rebuilt the broken fence post. Together. His hammer, her hands, the light fading fast. Inside, the fire burned strong. When she stepped through the door, she did not carry a weapon. He did not reach for one. He lit the lamp. She set the table. And the silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was full. That night she left the door unlatched, not out of carelessness, but something close to trust. And he didn't bolt it either. They didn't speak of what tomorrow might bring, but they sat together until the fire burned low again, the dog breathing soft between them, the river not. Far, the trees no longer watching. They had fought and lived and chosen, and sometimes that was enough.